In the royal heart of Neo-Assyria, where kings feared silence more than steel, one ruler's obsession with an heir dragged an empire into madness. This story uncovers how a grieving monarch turned ordinary tragedy, a miscarriage, into a weapon that reshaped his kingdom with terror. What you are about to hear is not myth nor exaggeration, but the chilling truth of how fear can unravel a throne from within in a world where bloodlines meant survival and every loss invited paranoia deeply. In the late 8th century BCE, the coronation of Ashar-Beli should have embodied the strength of Neo-Assyria, yet his reign began under the shadow of a father's violent death. The memory of that night, when palace guards stormed the royal wing in a failed coup, never loosened its grip. From the moment he claimed the throne, Ashar-Beli viewed every silence in the palace as a sign of plots reviving beneath polished stone floors. His advisors attributed his tension to the burdens of kingship, but those who had witnessed the midnight assassination understood that trauma shaped each decision he made. When Queen Naramtu conceived soon after his ascension, the palace exhaled with relief. A living heir would stabilize a court fractured by intrigue. Yet the queen's pregnancy progressed with quiet fragility, and midwives whispered concerns they dared not share aloud. Miscarriages were common, but their political consequences were lethal. The loss came in the early hours before dawn, marked only by a muffled cry from the queen's chamber and the hurried footsteps of attendants sent to fetch hot water. Protocol demanded silence. Royal miscarriages were documented privately, hidden from the ears of nobles hungry for advantage. Midwives cleaned the chamber with ritual composure, aware that grief inside the royal household could be interpreted as weakness beyond its walls. They informed Ashar-Beli with lowered eyes, expecting restrained mourning. Instead, the king demanded to know who had stood closest to the queen in the preceding day. The attendants exchanged anxious glances, but none anticipated the intensity of his reaction. Ashar-Beli dismissed explanations of illness or natural complications. To him, the miscarriage was not an act of fate, but the reopening of an old wound, proof that conspirators still moved unseen within the palace. He retreated to the rooftop terrace overlooking Nineveh, the city glowing beneath torches and moonlight. From that height, he remembered his father's final moments, the shouts of disloyal soldiers, the sound of steel striking stone as his lineage nearly ended. The memory fed his growing certainty of betrayal. To Ashar-Beli, the loss of an unborn child echoed the loss of a king, violent, personal, and orchestrated. He believed that the miscarriage was too timely, too familiar in its cruelty. Those who had benefited from his father's death, he reasoned, might now seek to erase his bloodline entirely. Within hours, rumors spread through the palace that the king had ordered surveillance of the women's wing. Servants walked with lowered heads, fearing that any misstep would be interpreted as treachery. Even the queen, recovering in silence, sensed that her personal grief had become a political crisis beyond her control. Ashar-Beli summoned his most trusted advisors, demanding reports on court factions, recent visitors, and any unexplained movements near the queen's chambers. They offered cautious answers, knowing the king's temper had sharpened. But his eyes drifted past them, fixed on memories of old rivals who once threatened his father's rule. In the days that followed, the king's grief fused with suspicion. Every whisper in the corridors seemed calculated, every bowed head a disguise. The miscarriage no longer felt like an isolated misfortune, but the opening strike in a war he believed had never ended since the night his father fell. As the sun set behind the palace walls, Ashar-Beli stood alone, convinced that unseen enemies moved in the shadows beneath him. The child had not cried, but its silence echoed through his thoughts as a warning. In that moment, his fear hardened into tyranny fully. The palace of Nineveh, once a place of quiet ritual and predictable order, had grown cold in the weeks following the queen's second miscarriage. Ashar-Beli, who had endured the first loss with the practiced restraint expected of an Assyrian king, now found cracks forming in the mask he had spent a lifetime perfecting. He walked the polished corridors with a restless energy, his fingers tapping against bronze doorframes, his eyes sharp enough to make even seasoned generals lower their gaze. Where grief had once sat quietly behind his ribs, suspicion now nested and expanded like smoke. Inside the secluded women's quarters, the atmosphere had shifted from ceremonial calm to a suffocating tension. No king was ever meant to intrude there, to question the routines that had remained unchanged for generations. Yet Ashar-Beli stepped past the carved wooden threshold with soldiers at his back, violating laws so old they were spoken of only in proverbs. The queen's attendants froze mid-task, their hands covered in oils, powders, or threads. Physicians bowed deeply, unable to look the king in the eye. Even the wet nurses, women chosen for their purity and lineage, trembled as Ashar-Beli's voice thundered with accusations none dared respond to. He believed the loss of 2 heirs could not be nature's doing. Someone, somewhere behind these perfumed curtains, was sabotaging the bloodline of kings. Poison, witchcraft, treason in his mind, these were the only explanations left. He demanded interrogations under the strict codes of palace law, summoning scribes to record every statement, every hesitation, every tear. Those who stuttered under questioning were pulled aside for harsher scrutiny. Those who remained silent were assumed guilty. The women's wing, once a sanctuary, became a labyrinth of whispered fears. Unsatisfied with testimony alone, Ashar-Beli summoned the Tahartu ritual purity inspectors, traditionally called only after omens or funerary rites. Never before had they been ordered to examine the private chambers of royal women. Carrying clay lamps and thin bronze tools, they sifted through baskets, lifted carpets, inspected wall niches, and studied the queen's cosmetics as if they were poisonous talismans. They recorded the presence of crushed rose petals, ash from incense burned during prayers, small bundles of mint for fragrance, and simple clay charms meant to ensure fertility. Everything they found was ordinary, familiar, harmless. But Ashar-Beli was no longer capable of seeing anything as harmless. When he read the inventory lists, he twisted every mundane detail into proof of betrayal. Rose petals became a possible masking agent. Mint leaves could be ground into a stimulant. Clay charms resembled amulets used by village witches. He read through each page with widening eyes, convincing himself the conspirators were cunning enough to hide in plain sight. The more his advisors tried to temper his suspicions, the deeper he sank into the shadows of his own imagination. Fear spread through the palace faster than any decree. Servants tiptoed through corridors. Attendants whispered that the king had stopped sleeping, stalking the palace gardens long after moonrise. Some said he spoke to the statues of past kings, begging them to tell him where the traitor hid. Others claimed they heard him muttering that the gods themselves were testing his strength. But everything changed on one chilling night when Ashar-Beli stepped into the Hall of Ancestors, stared at the glowing braziers, and declared that the enemy was not among the servants or attendants. It was within his own blood. The accusation that the enemy hid within his own bloodline did not leave Ashar-Beli's mind. It expanded, hardened, and finally narrowed onto a single person. His younger sister, Princess Belitu, had always been a force within the palace, quiet, intelligent, and politically sharp in ways the king both admired and feared. Their late father had trusted her counsel, sometimes even over his. In Assyria, royal women were far more than decorative figures. They were strategists, diplomats, the invisible threads holding entire alliances in place. But in Ashar-Beli's unraveling mind, every strength became a reason for suspicion. Belitu had recently disagreed with Queen Naram-II over ceremonial precedence during a festival procession. To the court physician who mentioned it, it was a trivial rivalry between 2 powerful women sharing the same confined world. But when this detail reached Ashar-Beli, already trembling under the weight of fear and grief, it bloomed into proof. Proof that Belitu wanted influence beyond the boundaries allowed to a princess. Proof that she resented the queen's rising authority. Proof, in his mind, that she could orchestrate something far darker. He stormed into the Hall of Records, demanding every tablet involving Belitu's activities over the last year. Scribes scrambled to obey. They produced lists of her correspondences, her ceremonial duties, her visits to temples, her private audiences with nobles, all ordinary duties of a royal woman. But to Ashar-Beli, every tablet felt like a hidden confession. Why had she visited the temple of Ishtar so often? Why had she written to governors in the West? Why had she brought rare herbs from her mother's homeland months earlier? Each harmless fact twisted into treason as his paranoia sharpened. The moment he confronted her, Belitu's shock was genuine. She stood before him with steady eyes, refusing to bow in fear, even as guards flanked her. Ashar-Beli interpreted her steady composure as arrogance, evidence that she felt untouchable. The courtiers watching the scene later said the air itself seemed to tighten, as though the palace walls recognized that a line had been crossed from which no one could return. "You weaken the queen," Ashar-Beli declared before the assembled council. "You did this to break the throne." Belitu's voice did not waver. "I would never harm my blood. I would never harm our future." But Ashar-Beli no longer believed in innocence. In Assyria, the king's accusation carried the weight of divine judgment. It did not need proof. And so Belitu's fate was sealed the moment he spoke the words aloud. Her attendants were seized first. Their screams echoed through the marble halls as soldiers dragged them into side chambers for questioning. They were slapped, beaten, and forced to recount every detail of Belitu's daily life. When nothing incriminating surfaced, Ashar-Beli insisted they were lying. He ordered Belitu's private rooms ransacked. Cabinets were overturned, garments shredded, writing tablets broken open as if they might bleed secrets. The search produced nothing. No poison, no hidden tablets, no suspicious symbols. Only the ordinary objects of a royal woman's life. Yet Ashar-Beli stood among the scattered remains of her belongings, convinced the absence of evidence was part of her cunning. Before sunset, guards seized Belitu by the arms. She didn't fight, though her voice trembled only once when she whispered Ashar-Beli's childhood nickname. For a brief moment, something flickered across the king's face, pain, confusion, memory, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Belitu was dragged toward the staircase that spiraled into the depths beneath the palace. A place known only in frightened whispers. A chamber reserved for traitors. A place from which none returned. The descent into the EIGID began with a silence so heavy it seemed to swallow sound itself. Belitu had walked the upper halls of Nineveh with dignity her entire life, her footsteps echoing through sunlit courtyards and polished stone. But now her sandals scraped against rough, uneven steps carved centuries earlier, leading into the bowels of the palace, the chamber where high-born traitors faced the judgment of kings. Many rulers never set foot here, allowing interrogators to do the brutal work in their stead. But Ashar-Beli insisted on attending personally, proof that his unraveling mind could no longer separate duty from desperation. Torches flickered along the walls, casting warped shadows across the stone. The chamber smelled of damp earth, old blood, and the lingering presence of fear. Ancient Assyrians believed that truth emerged not from logic, but from endurance. If a person collapsed, it meant the gods had withdrawn their protection. Ashar-Beli clung to this belief with the fervor of a drowning man grasping rope. Belitu was bound to a vertical frame, her wrists secured above her head. Her attendants were kept outside, forced to listen to every cry. The king stood only a few steps away, close enough for her to see the exhaustion hollowing his eyes. When he spoke, his voice held not triumph, but the raw edge of a man tearing himself apart. "You have weakened my house," he said. "You will tell me why." Belitu's reply was calm, steady, painfully human. "Ashar-Beli, I loved our father as you did. I guided you because he wished it. I have never sought to harm you." To Ashar-Beli, her composure confirmed his darkest fear. She was too calm, too collected, too certain of her innocence. He saw not his sister, but a conspirator hiding behind noble restraint. The interrogators began with stress positions. Belitu's body was bent forward, arms extended unnaturally, forcing her muscles to tremble. Hours passed. She gritted her teeth, refusing to let the chamber hear her pain. When her legs buckled, she was plunged into cold water, held until her breath faltered, then lifted gasping into the stale air. Sleep was not permitted. Each time she drifted toward unconsciousness, a bucket of icy water jolted her back. Ashar-Beli watched every moment. At times he turned away, gripping the carved pillar beside him as if he might crush it. At other times, he studied her face with a strange longing for her to confess, for the torment to yield meaning, for the miscarriages to finally make sense. He needed her guilt like a starving man needed bread. Belitu held to the only weapon she had, the truth. She spoke of their youth, of the orchard where they played, of their mother's songs, of the nights she stood guard outside his chambers when he feared the storms. These memories, meant to soften him, only deepened his anguish. He interpreted them as manipulation. On the third night, her body began to fail. The palace physician stepped forward hesitantly, warning that her pulse was weakening, that her skin was growing cold. But Ashar-Beli no longer heard the living world. He was listening only for divine judgment. He ordered the torment to continue. Belitu did not scream in her final hours. Her voice faded into whisper, then silence, her head lowering as exhaustion consumed her. When dawn painted the chamber with thin light, she remained upright only because the ropes held her. Ashar-Beli stared at her motionless form, searching for clarity, for revelation, for the truth he expected the gods to deliver through her suffering. But none came. While Belitu withered in the chamber beneath the throne, Queen Naramtu lived suspended between dread and duty. The palace above carried a strange quiet, as if every stone recognized that something sacred had been broken. Serpents moved like ghosts, guards avoided meeting her eyes. The air felt thick with unspoken fear. Naramtu, once celebrated for her grace and diplomatic intelligence, now existed under the crushing weight of her own womb, a fragile vessel whose failure had become the axis of the king's madness. Deep inside her chambers, she lay on a cushioned platform, attended by midwives who no longer dared touch her unless ordered. After Belitu's arrest, every action inside the women's wing required written record. Every herb, every sip of water, every adjustment of the queen's bedding. Palace scribes sat at the edge of the room with clay tablets, documenting the smallest gestures. Naramtu could not breathe without hearing the scratch of a stylus recording it. She was 6 months pregnant, and every passing day tightened the coil of terror within her. She had seen miscarriages before, among servants and whispered stories from the countryside, but she had never imagined her own survival could depend on preventing one. The memory of Ashar-Beli's eyes when he burst into her chamber after the last loss still haunted her, wild, hollow, searching for a traitor. Searching for blood to spill. This child had to live, not only for the kingdom, but for every woman trapped inside the palace walls. Yet her body betrayed her hope. She woke at night to cramps so sharp they stole her breath. Her hands trembled when she felt the baby shift. The midwives, though skilled, were too afraid to offer comfort. Their knowledge had become a curse. Any suggestion of danger might be interpreted as confession. Naramtu prayed daily, kneeling before a small carved statue of Ishtar. But her prayers were not for health or protection. They were pleas for mercy, mercy for her, for the unborn child, for the silent women whose futures depended on the whims of a king who no longer recognized the boundary between fear and truth. When she fainted during a routine inspection, panic erupted. One of the junior attendants screamed, dropping a bowl of scented water. The scribe scribbled furiously, recording the moment as if it were evidence in a trial. Naramtu regained consciousness to a room filled with trembling servants and the metallic taste of fear in the air. Word spread quickly. The queen collapsed. Rumors ignited like dry reeds, poison, witchcraft, divine anger. The palace guards grew restless, their suspicion turning toward one another. No one dared consider the simplest truth, that grief, confinement, and constant terror were unraveling her from within. Ashar-Beli arrived moments later, breathless, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. He stood over her, demanding to know who had touched her last, who had given her water, who had prepared the herbs she burned. His fury was not loud, it was the quiet, trembling kind that promised devastation. Naram-Tu tried to speak, but her voice cracked. She could not tell him that her collapse came not from treachery, but from despair. He would not have heard it. To Ashar-Beli, every tremor in her body was sabotage, every weakness a whispered attack against his bloodline. The room fell silent as the king's attention shifted to the women around her. His gaze lingered on them with dangerous intensity. Someone, he believed, had already taken the first step toward another miscarriage, and he would tear the palace apart to find them. Ashar-Beli's suspicion, once focused on his sister, had now expanded to encompass anyone with proximity to the queen's womb. No one held more influence in that domain than the senior midwife, Shalaya, a woman whose hands had guided generations of royal heirs safely into the world. She had served the royal family for decades, her knowledge revered and her loyalty assumed. But in a palace ruled by terror, experience was insufficient protection. Ashar-Beli believed that if harm had been done, it had been done by those closest to the queen, those whose touch could kill without trace. Shalaya was summoned to the Hall of Judgment, her fingers trembling despite years of discipline. The royal council assembled, seated on high-backed chairs carved with symbols of divine authority. The scribes sat in rows, clay tablets poised to capture every word. The attendants of the queen watched from the edges of the room, silent witnesses to a trial that had already been decided in the king's mind. Ashar-Beli's eyes burned with the intensity of accusation. "Explain," he demanded, voice sharp enough to cut through stone, "how the womb that carries my heir has failed. Twice. Do not speak of disease or chance. Tell me, Shalaya, which poison or curse has been placed upon her?" Shalaya spoke slowly, carefully. She recounted the effects of malnutrition, the stress of royal duties, the unpredictable vulnerabilities of human gestation. She mentioned herbs used to calm the queen, the timing of diet, the patterns of fetal growth. Each explanation was grounded in centuries of observed knowledge, a blend of science and tradition. The council murmured uneasily. Some believed her words, but fear silenced their support. Any hesitation, any suggestion that miscarriages might happen naturally could be interpreted as complicity. Ashar-Beli's gaze bore into each member, demanding allegiance not to justice, but to his conviction. Shalaya continued, noting the limits of human control. "Even in the finest care, some births fail," she said. "Even in temples blessed by Ishtar, fate will sometimes refuse our petition." Her words were careful, precise, and truthful. Yet the king's mind could not accept them. To Ashar-Beli, the queen's losses were deliberate. His father's death had taught him that misfortune often had a hand guiding it. He refused the notion of randomness. He would not allow his lineage to be imperiled by chance. Every syllable Shalaya spoke became evidence against her. Each measured pause, each respectful sigh, each meticulous record she presented seemed to confirm deceit. The council, under the weight of fear, sided with him. Shalaya was sentenced to ritual inspection, a process both invasive and humiliating. Her body, her knowledge, her very dignity became instruments of public theater. Ancient rites were invoked, meant historically to reveal sorcery, now twisted into tools of coercion and dominance. The humiliation was immense, the psychological pressure suffocating. As the inspection began, Shalaya collapsed, her body yielding to shame, fear, and exhaustion. Ashar-Beli, unflinching, stepped forward and declared, "No miscarriage occurs without human intention. There is no accident in the throne of Assyria." In that moment, the palace shifted. Fear solidified into paralysis. The women of the court, the attendants, the scribes, even the physicians, all understood that natural tragedy had been outlawed. In Ashar-Beli's palace, survival demanded complicity, and innocence had become a liability more dangerous than any crime. Shalaya's ordeal set a precedent. No one dared speak truth that contradicted the king's vision. History, reason, and human fragility were subordinated to the obsession of a man who could not distinguish death by fate from death by conspiracy. The seeds of irreversible darkness had been sown, and the palace trembled under their weight. Ashar-Beli's fear, once private and restrained, had metastasized into total dominion over the palace. Every corner, every corridor, every servant's movement was scrutinized under his relentless gaze. The grand halls of Nineveh, once alive with ceremonial life and political discourse, had transformed into a fortress of suspicion. Guards inspected every dish brought to the royal table, examined every textile that touched the queen's skin, and questioned every messenger passing through the gates. What had begun as cautious vigilance had become outright tyranny. Officials who hesitated, even for a heartbeat, in their duties were subjected to brutal punishment. A minor scribe, guilty only of misrecording the date of a ceremonial feast, was publicly lashed, his cries echoing through the hall and serving as grim instruction for all. The miscarriages, once tragic accidents, had become a political instrument. The king wielded them as justification for purges, for fear-driven obedience, for crushing anyone who might threaten his lineage. Court nobles whispered behind locked doors, speculating that the king's mind had fractured under the weight of grief and obsession. They spoke of sleepless nights and strange, muttered conversations with shadows on the walls. Yet, despite their suspicions, none dared act. In Neo-Assyria, dissent invited destruction, and Ashar-Beli's paranoia had grown too dangerous to confront. Late one night, the queen's chamber was filled with urgent cries. Naramtu, weak from fear and constant strain, began bleeding. The news reached the king like a bell tolling doom. He stormed through the corridors, the sound of his sandals striking stone, a drumbeat of judgment. Those present at the queen's side, midwives, attendants, scribes, were accused of conspiracy. Each movement, each glance was interpreted as evidence. The king's fury was not solely political, it was personal, a deep terror that mirrored the chaos which had claimed his father years earlier. Ashar-Beli had grown convinced that history would repeat itself, that the dynasty would end if no one paid for the miscarriages. He demanded immediate lockdown of the palace. Gates were sealed, courtyards emptied, and all communication with the outside world cut off. Messengers, arriving with petitions or news from the provinces, were turned away or detained. The king insisted that the culprit, real or imagined, could not be allowed to escape, could not carry treachery beyond the palace walls. The atmosphere grew suffocating. Servants moved like shadows, fearful that even a breath of hesitation might provoke a new accusation. Nobles lingered in silence, afraid that conversation itself might betray them. The air was thick with anxiety, and the palace seemed to hold its breath as though Nineveh itself had been imprisoned within these walls. Every glance at the king risked interpretation, every step could signal guilt. Ashar-Beli's paranoia had not merely altered behavior, it had reshaped reality itself, creating a microcosm of terror within the heart of the empire. By morning, it was clear that the palace was no longer a seat of governance. It had become a cage. Ashar-Beli, convinced that someone among the courtiers, or perhaps the physicians and midwives, was actively working against him, refused to eat or rest. His obsession with uncovering the traitor consumed every hour, every breath, every thought. The miscarriages had become the lens through which he viewed all existence, proof that betrayal was everywhere, proof that the line of succession was under constant assault. The king's paranoia had transformed the palace into a crucible of fear, and in this crucible, no one could survive unscathed. The seeds of ruin had been sown, and Nineveh itself seemed poised to tremble beneath the weight of a ruler who could no longer distinguish reality from the echoes of his own dread. With the palace gates sealed, Nineveh itself seemed to shrink under Ashar-Beli's tightening grip. The streets emptied as traders abandoned the markets, fearing the consequences of an unintentional slight against the king. Temples, normally bustling with devotion, were quieted. Priests avoided public ceremonies, unwilling to risk even subtle gestures that might be misread as complicity. Messengers carrying reports from distant provinces were turned away or confined to small holding cells, their scrolls confiscated. The city's heartbeat had slowed to a whisper, every citizen conscious that the king's paranoia extended far beyond the palace walls. Ashar-Beli's fear had metastasized, encompassing not only those within the palace, but all who might touch or influence his lineage. Inside the throne rooms and private chambers, the air was thick with tension. Queen Naramtu, still recovering from her earlier collapse, had barely begun to regain strength when her body betrayed her again. She suffered a late-term miscarriage, one that left her pallid and trembling, her hands pressed to her abdomen as if to physically hold her life together. The palace physicians, bound by loyalty and terror, had acted with meticulous care, yet their skill was powerless against fate. Ashar-Beli refused to see reality. He erupted in fury, accusing the physicians of deliberate sabotage, of weakening the child through negligent treatment. He demanded their immediate execution, believing the empire's future hung on discovering someone who had violated him from within. Historically, physicians in the ancient Near East were often scapegoated for outcomes beyond their control. Ashar-Beli's logic mirrored these patterns but magnified them through obsession. Two physicians, loyal for decades, were condemned and publicly executed, their deaths meant as both punishment and warning. Palace scribes and attendants were ordered to record these events in exhaustive detail, their tremulous hands etching fear into clay tablets for posterity. The king's paranoia did not end with punishment. He decreed an empire-wide investigation into what he termed womb crimes, summoning reports from provincial governors, midwives, and noblewomen. Each miscarriage, each premature birth, each stillborn child was scrutinized as potential evidence of conspiracy. The line between accident and treachery had vanished, replaced entirely by suspicion. Every woman in the palace, every servant, every attendant became a potential conspirator. As days passed, the palace grew more silent. Even conversation, once vibrant and necessary for the functioning of the court, became dangerous. A whispered warning, a slight hesitation, the smallest gesture could provoke accusation. The sorrow that had entered the king's chambers with the queen's loss expanded into the halls of governance, infecting every room with dread. Ashar-Beli's obsession had eclipsed reason. The queen, broken and fearful, retreated into herself, her body and spirit weighed down by grief and terror. Her attendants whispered of fainting spells and pale hands that no longer held warmth. The palace became a mausoleum of anxiety, its walls saturated with the quiet terror of those who could not escape. By night, Ashar-Beli would walk the corridors alone, muttering accusations to shadows and statues alike, convinced that even the stone figures of the palace might carry treachery in their gaze. The empire's future, its lineage, its very survival, all had been imprisoned alongside the courtiers, sealed within walls of suspicion and fear. The child, lost in the queen's womb, had not been taken by conspirators or magic. It had been claimed by the fragility of life itself. Yet in Ashar-Beli's eyes, every heartbeat of the palace was evidence of rebellion. The kingdom and all within it were now hostages to his obsession. Ashar-Beli's paranoia had reached a threshold beyond reason. The miscarriages, the failed heirs, the imagined conspiracies, all converged in his mind into a single terrifying narrative. The royal house was tainted, cursed by betrayal, and only extreme measures could restore its purity. Historical records note that rulers in Assyria often invoked purification rites after calamities, but Ashar-Beli's vision was uniquely brutal, a political theater of suffering designed to cleanse the throne through blood. At dawn, he summoned the nobles he suspected of disloyalty. Each arrived in trembling submission, understanding that accusation alone was sufficient for punishment. The king commanded them to participate in a ritual derived from purification traditions, but twisted into an instrument of fear. The courtyard was arranged with stark precision, high platforms for observation, channels for blood to flow, and attendants ready to carry out his orders with exacting brutality. No priestly chant could mask the terror. This was not a spiritual rite, but a calculated performance of dominance. Belitu, Ashar-Beli's sister, had been detained for weeks, subjected to interrogations and torture that left her exhausted, her body a canvas of pain. At dawn, she was brought to the ritual site. Her eyes, once bright with cunning and intelligence, were now dimmed by deprivation and fear. The king, standing above, declared her death a necessary sacrifice to restore the fertility of the royal house. "Only through blood," he proclaimed, "will the wombs of the queens be purified. Only through the suffering of traitors will the line of Ashar-Beli endure." Belitu, resolute even in exhaustion, spoke her final words as the executioner approached. "You will die without heirs," she warned, her voice trembling but unbroken. Ashar-Beli dismissed it as the ramblings of a traitor, a woman broken by his authority. Yet those present felt the weight of her declaration, the tension of inevitability that even the strongest walls could not contain. The nobles, silent and pale, recognized the fragility of their own survival. The execution proceeded, precise and unflinching, leaving the courtyard heavy with the scent of blood and the echoes of disbelief. The priests of Ashur, who had long sanctioned royal authority, observed in silence. Historically, those who sanctioned close-kin killings often faced moral and political backlash. They withdrew quietly, their robes trailing like shadows across the courtyard, signaling to the court that divine support had receded. In their absence, the king stood alone, his dominion intact yet hollow, his throne seemingly empowered by cruelty but silently undermined by isolation. Ashar-Beli continued the ritual with other nobles, extracting confessions through fear, demonstrating submission and reinforcing his absolute control. Yet with each act, the court grew quieter, the air more oppressive. The palace walls seemed to close in, and whispers of impending doom spread among those who survived. The king's obsession, historically familiar among rulers who suffered succession crises, had escalated into systemic terror. By nightfall, the palace was a mausoleum of authority achieved through horror. Nobles, attendants, and officials existed in the shadow of potential accusation. The miscarriage of the queen had been avenged in blood, yet no certainty of future fertility was guaranteed. Ashar-Beli had traded the empire's safety for personal obsession, constructing a kingdom where survival depended on subjugation to fear. The stage was set. The throne remained occupied, but the king was increasingly isolated, surrounded by silent witnesses whose loyalty existed only as a reaction to terror. The foundations of power trembled, unseen, beneath the weight of cruelty. And in that tremor, the first hints of the kingdom's inevitable unraveling began to whisper. The palace, once a hive of authority and ceremony, had become a mausoleum of fear. Ashar-Beli, the king who had commanded suffering to enforce obedience, now faced the collapse of the very world he had tried to control. Queen Naram-II, exhausted by grief, stress, and the constant terror that defined her existence, succumbed to fever. It was not poison, nor the hand of a conspirator, but the relentless toll of trauma and anxiety that claimed her life. Her passing left Ashar-Beli untethered, stripped of purpose, and confronted with the emptiness that his paranoia had created. He retreated into the throne room, locking the doors and refusing food. The stone figures that lined the chamber guardians of the palace, silent witnesses to centuries of kings, became his only companions. He muttered accusations to their carved faces, demanding answers that would never arrive. Every shadow, every flicker of torchlight seemed to carry evidence of betrayal. The walls themselves, steeped in the blood and fear of countless court intrigues, felt as though they were pressing closer. For the first time, the king felt vulnerable to the forces he had imagined so constantly in others. Outside, the nobles, aware that the empire teetered on the brink of collapse, acted quietly but decisively. They did not storm the palace with raised swords. There was no battle, no spectacle. Instead, they moved with a resigned certainty, driven by the knowledge that the kingdom could not survive its ruler's unraveling. The gates were forced open, and the corridors filled with men whose loyalty now existed only as a sense of necessity rather than fear or devotion. Ashar-Beli was found seated on the steps of the throne, dehydrated, delirious, and muttering accusations at invisible enemies. He claimed, in fragmented whispers, that everyone had stolen his heirs, that treachery had seeped into every chamber, every bed, every scroll of the palace archives. His once mighty authority, enforced through terror and suffering, had crumbled under the weight of his own obsession. There were no voices of opposition, no foreign armies, no rebellion, only the silent truth that his paranoia had consumed itself. He died that night, not by sword or poison, but by the very fear and obsession he had inflicted upon others. Historical records from the Neo-Assyrian period describe similar spirals of psychological collapse among rulers who had relied excessively on terror and suspicion. Ashar-Beli's final hours mirrored these patterns, a sovereign undone not by enemies, but by the intensifying grip of his own mind. When the palace quieted, the truth emerged with stark clarity. There had been no poison, no hidden plot, no deliberate act to end the royal pregnancies. The miscarriages that had ignited a spiral of cruelty were natural tragedies, common in the harsh realities of the ancient world. Yet in Ashar-Beli's mind, these events had been transformed into political warfare, a justification for terror that cost lives, loyalty, and the stability of the empire. The empire survived, but the throne remained a symbol of what unchecked obsession could yield. Historians would later note that the reign of Ashar-Beli became a cautionary tale, that the fear of losing control, when allowed to metastasize, can destroy not only the individual, but all those who serve under him. In the silence of the palace, the echoes of suffering remained, a reminder that human cruelty is often born not from external enemies, but from the mind's own inability to accept the fragility of life. Ashar-Beli had sought to dominate destiny, to bend fate to his will through fear, surveillance, and blood. In the end, he ruled over nothing but shadows, leaving the throne empty, a silent testament to a king undone by his own terror. The miscarriages, once tragic and natural, had been converted into instruments of terror, and in that transformation, history would remember the cost of obsession more vividly than any battle or conquest.